Hello guys, this is hopefully going to be one in a series of videos covering content for the iGCSE exam. I am expecting you to watch this carefully. You need to make notes as if you were in class, and also there are a few tasks that I need you to complete as you go through the video. This is in place of a lesson, so it's important that you do kind of engage with it, but it will also hopefully be quite a useful aid for revision as we get closer to the exam. It has been quite difficult to embed lots of media, so what I also need you to do is open the Audio Mac playlist, as well as a quiz I've created on Edmodo. If possible, I suggest that you have Edmodo open on a laptop or computer, and that you watch this video and use the Audio Mac playlist on a separate device. That should make things easier for you. This is all within the first assignment that I've created. I've called it Lesson 1 Minimalism, so all the necessary links are there. So my plan is that each lesson will start with a listening question before we go into a specific topic. This lesson has a few theory questions at the beginning, and I would like you to do them, but message me if you are struggling with any of these questions. So for example, there's one which is relating to cadences. If you're getting them all wrong, or most of them wrong, you need to let me know so that I can give you some extra support, because at this stage, I'm hoping that theory is pretty much nailed down and locked in. Again, I've put all the relevant links in one assignment on Edmodo. I'm calling this Lesson 1 Minimalism. If you need to pause the video in order to get everything set up, then do that now, but otherwise I'm going to move on. Okay, so a quick starter for you to do on paper. I've got some definitions here, and you need to find the correct terms. So pause the video and have a go at listing these. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I would just list 1 to 6 and then write the correct terms, but pause the video now. Okay, if you need a bit more help, here is the list of terms. They're not in the correct order. You need to find the correct order. So if you haven't got all of these correct, have a go now. So pause the video, otherwise carry on. So I'm putting the answers up here. If you have struggled with any of these terms, I suggest you make a note and go back to the vocab list, which again is on Edmodo, in order to revise. It would be good to start compiling flashcards if you haven't done so already, but here are the terms there. Okay, so now you have 4 exercises. You need to identify the key signature of each exercise and then the cadence type. If this is something, again, you're really struggling with, please send me a message on Edmodo so that I can give you a bit of extra support. I'm not explaining cadences or keys here, so it's important that you let me know if you're struggling. Pause the video and have a go at this. Right, so question 1A, the key signature is C minor, and it's called G major going to C minor, so it's 5 to 1, or a perfect cadence. Question 2, we're in A major, and the cadence is imperfect, because you are going from A, chord 1, to E, which is chord 5. Question 3, we're in B flat major, and you're going from F major to B flat. It's a perfect cadence. And lastly, you're in C major, and it's an interrupted cadence. It might be a little bit confusing because you've got the 2 natural symbols, so that just tells you there's no sharps or flats, and you're going chord 5 to 6, G major to A minor. This next exercise, it would be great if you have manuscript paper to write, so that you can write out the intervals properly, but if not, just list the letter names that you need in order to complete the intervals. Imagine that the given pitch is the lowest, so you're adding a note on top in order to create the interval. So for example, in number 1, the lowest note is the C, and you need to create the major third above that. Let me know again if you're struggling with this, otherwise have a go by pausing the video. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these. Number 1, the major third, you need an E natural above the C. Number 2, to create a major second, you need an F natural above the E flat. Number 3, we're in bass clef, so remember all cows eat grass. That's an E natural there, and you need an F natural in order to create a minor second, the do-do Jaws theme. Question 4, still in bass clef, and you've got a G there on the bottom line. So you think G8 beat C, you need a C natural in order to create a perfect fourth. I've been mean with the last two, and actually it says 5 and 5, that's great. Should be 5 and 6. So real question 5. In alto clef, you've got a D there, so be careful, and you need an E natural above it in order to create a major second. So that should actually be on the line above the note that you're given there. And the last question, again, we are in alto clef, and so you have got an A on the second line up, and you need to add an E in order to create a perfect fifth. Just like before, if you're thinking, oh my goodness, I've got those all wrong, or I've got most of them wrong, then you need to let me know, okay? And it might be actually you've got a couple of things. So you might say, hi, Mr. Morris, I need some help with cadences, and I need some help with intervals. Right, last question before we move on. For this, you need to access track 1 from the Lesson 1 Minimalism audio map playlist, again, which I've sent you via Edmodo. You need to complete questions 1 to 5 in the Edmodo quiz. Keep the quiz open throughout the whole lesson, and once you've gone through the whole video, you've completed all the questions, then you can submit it to me, okay? You can go back and forth through the questions, and also you can play the audio file really as many times as you need. I suggest no more than 2 or 3 times, okay? So I'm going to show you the questions now here, but these are the same questions on Edmodo. So pause this video and have a go at completing the quiz now. If there's a problem with the quiz, then I will go through the answers here anyway, but pause the video and have a go now. Okay, so moving on, just to go through those questions. The first question, which was, which woodwind instrument plays the melody at the beginning of the extract? And the answer is clarinet. Okay, so again, some of you, I imagine, have got this wrong. And if you're still struggling to identify different woodwind instruments, as I've said before, you need to spend time on YouTube listening to examples of the different woodwind instruments. Just type in clarinet solo or oboe solo, for example. Next question, again, is about a woodwind instrument. The next one to play the same melody that we've just heard is the bassoon. And it enters melodically by playing an ascending major scale. And the period of music is the Romantic, and the composer is Rossini. You might know this piece of music, it's quite famous. It's actually an overture to an opera, Barbara of Seville. Right, we're going to move on. So we're going to focus now on 20th century music, particularly minimalism. But I want to remind you that in theory, in exam, you could be played any genre or any type of music from the 20th century, and so it's important you can recognize particular characteristics. However, you only need to name the following styles: Impressionism, Neoclassicism, Minimalism, and jazz, as well as musical theatre. So in theory, you could have a piece of expressionism or serialism in the exam, or in fact any other weird and wonderful style from the 20th century. You wouldn't need to name them, but you would have to recognise it's from the 20th century, and also justify why or how it's from the 20th century. So some particular ideas, or rather we're going to go through some ideas, but what I want you to do now is complete the next question on Edmodo, which is question 6. And you're given a list of potential justifications, and I want you to select all of the justifications which apply to 20th century music. So imagine that you're listening to an extract and it could be 20th century because, and then you're going to select the correct answers. Pause the video now in order to complete that exercise before coming back. Okay, so let's go through these now. These are the answers you should have selected. So the first one is dissonant harmony. So functional harmony would be incorrect because that's dealing with chords within a key. You might have that of course, in an example of 20th century music, but we're now thinking about non-functional harmony, so crunchy chords, dissonant harmony. Piano and orchestra, whilst you could have the piano as a solo instrument, say from the classical period onwards, some composers in the 20th century used the piano as any other instrument in the orchestra. Not all the time, so again, it does depend on the piece that you're listening to. One of my favourite words, ambiguous. So ambiguous tonality, meaning not a clear sense of major or minor or even modal, somewhere in between. Again, it depends on the piece of music, but you could have a very, very large orchestra. And lastly, we've spoken about this before, this idea of having an angular melody. This is different from having a melody which is stepwise, moving up one note at a time, for example, C to D to E to F, or even C, E, G. Here, the intervals are quite jagged, quite wide-ranging, and that's what we mean by an angular melody. So you do need to bear in mind that there were lots of different styles and trends in the 20th century, and so these statements don't apply to all the music. It's just like you can't say the piece is Baroque because there's a string-dominated orchestra, particularly if it's a solo for harpsichord, because that would be ridiculous. Cough, no one ever does that, do they? Right, there are lots of other possibilities, and it would be helpful for you to have these all down in your notes. I've put some more here. Some key ones, just to highlight, are this idea of having an extended instrument section. So, for example, you might have in your woodwind section, higher than your flute, you might have a piccolo, just like you would in a romantic orchestra, but you might also have clarinets in different keys. So you might have a B-flat clarinet and E-flat clarinet. As well as your oboes, you might have cor anglais, and you might have bassoons and contrabassoons. So that's what we mean by an extended instrument section. When I say extremes of register, what I mean by that is you could have really high notes or really low notes. We've spoken about this idea of atonal music. Remember, that means when it's not in a specific key. So in fact, there's the absence of a key. A good example would be serialism, which is what we call 12-tone music. And lastly, when we're talking talking ostinatos, we're talking about repeated musical ideas. Right, moving on, thinking about minimalism particularly. Now, when we try to define minimalism, I always go back to one of my favourite quotes by the composer Lamont Young, and that is, that which is made with a minimum of means. So essentially, getting the most out of very little material. Well, that's what I take from that quote. Some other key things to consider here are sort of the origin. So minimalism really came about in the 1960s and developed through the 60s and the 70s. It actually happened on the west coast of America. So it's good to be aware of that, particularly when we look at some specific composers. Now, as a term, it doesn't just relate to music, it relates to visual art, it relates to literature, to architecture, across all culture, actually. And a lot of people argue that it's a reaction against all of the kind of crazy stuff that was happening when we talk about expressionism and serialism, atonal music. Some would argue that minimalism was a reaction against that. And again, this idea of making the most out of very little material, which relates to that initial quote there. Now, minimalism didn't just happen. There were lots of styles which influenced it, particularly as composers were looking to other cultures for inspiration. Some key musical cultures which are said to have influenced minimalism are West African music, Indonesian gamelan, and Indian classical music. So when we're talking about West African music, a key or an obvious influence would be the use of ostinatos, these patterns that repeat, and interlocking rhythms, which are key and core to West African music. Gamelan music similarly deals with ostinatos, but also actually has quite often heterophonic textures where you have the same idea but played at different speeds. So augmented or you have sort of augmentation or diminution of the same idea. In minimalism, we often use drones as well, which is related to Indian classical music, which we will be looking at as well. Now, what I've done is I've listed some of the key features of minimalism, which are also good justifications for the exam. So again, make sure you get these down, that you understand them. It might help to pause the video as you record these in your notes. Just to explain a few of these, again, when we say a motif, we mean just a small musical gesture. It could be 2 or 3 notes, or it could be a bar of music. An ostinato is a fancy way of saying a loop or a riff. The idea of repeating a motif could be multiple times throughout a piece of music. When we talk about canon, it's a type of imitation where essentially the best way to think of it is repeating something exactly but in a different part and a different voice. So you might have a motif in a violin, and then that same motif comes again in a flute. And when we're talking about harmonic changes, we're talking about how often the chords change. So in minimalism, quite often chords change quite slowly. We might think about maybe Baroque or classical music where chords potentially change every beat or every 2 beats. But in minimalism, it might be that we hold on to a chord for a lot longer. So again, make sure you've got this list down before you move on. What I want you to do now is listen to a bit of a piece called clapping music. Now, you don't need to listen to the whole thing, but it's always good to do it. Just make sure you get a sense of the piece. Pause the video now and play track 2 on Audio Mac. It's called Clapping Music. Hopefully you've had a listen to the piece and you may have worked out that it's very simple actually. The key thing is you've got 2 performers and they use one rhythmic motif, which I've illustrated there. The rhythm is da 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 da. And they start together, they start in unison, but gradually that changes over time. In the recording that we listen to, or hopefully you listen to it, you have 8 repetitions in unison before the second performer then shifts by 1/8 note. And that starts to create this interesting new rhythm that we hear. This is called phase shifting. And the whole piece is built on this principle. So gradually, what happens is the second performer, again after 8 repetitions, shifts again by another 8th note. And then after 8 repetitions of that, again by another 8th note. And eventually, the 2 performers end back in time together, and that's how they end the piece. So this is a great example of the technique phase shifting, which was on one of the earlier slides. I also want you to listen to another piece. This is track 3. I've given you a short extract because it's actually a very long piece, but you don't even need to listen to the whole of the extract, but get a sense of it, please. So press pause now and listen to track 3, which is piano phase. Hopefully you've listened to piano phase now. I do recommend that actually if you've got a VPN, go onto YouTube and look up these pieces because you can get some really cool visualizations of how phase shifting works. But we're going to move on. Now you might recognize this title, I hope you do. Those of you who were with me in year 10, we looked at this piece, Electric Counterpoint. And this is, again, another good example of how a composer uses a particular compositional device, which I'll mention a little bit more in a moment. So press pause and have a listen. Again, you don't need to hear the whole extract. Now, there are lots of really interesting things going on in this piece, but there are a couple of key things I want to highlight. The first one is this idea of a layered approach to texture. So building the texture over time by introducing new parts. And that is a key feature of minimalism. The second is the idea of using note addition. So actually in this example, there's a very simple motif, But rather than just imitating that motif exactly, what the composer does is takes a little fragment. So they fragment the motif, they split it up, and then gradually build it up again in a second or the third voice, etc. And lastly, actually, each part is introduced in canon because they're taking the same motif, and whilst, yes, they are starting in a different place, they're playing exactly the same material. So again, this is a good example of using canon, which is typical of minimalism. Now, there are lots of other techniques used in this particular piece of music, but these are three things to consider, and I think it's a great piece of music, so you should definitely listen to all of it. And now, just to check that you've been listening, what I want you to do is go back onto Edmodo and actually answer questions 7 to 10. So you need to pause the quiz now to do that. I'm not going to go through those answers now. I will check your answers once you've submitted the quiz. Okay, moving on. Now, there are lots of composers who we might classify as being minimalist composers. These are three of my personal favourites. And actually, Steve Reich, he wrote all three examples of the pieces that you've just listened to. So clapping music, piano phase, and an electric counterpoint. I would strongly recommend that you listen to other composers, maybe particularly Philip Glass, as he's written some very interesting minimalist operas, concertos and soundtracks to films. It's a bit old now, but there's a really cool film called The Truman Show. If you haven't ever seen it, it is a classic, so I recommend it. And he wrote the soundtrack to that. Now, to finish this lesson, what I want you to do is actually answer a real exam question. I've put those questions on Edmodo. They are 11 to 17 in the quiz, and you need to use track 5 from the Audio Mac playlist in order to answer those questions. I'd try and answer it all within 3 listens if you can. And when you're done, if you just submit the quiz, and that will send everything to me. But if you've got any questions or problems, then please do send me a message on Edmodo or an email. But actually, Edmodo's probably the most convenient for me, if that's okay. Right, see you next time.